the sweltering heat of July 25, 1972, Associated Press reporter Jean Heller sat at her typewriter in Washington, D.C., preparing to file a story that would shatter America's faith in medical authority forever. The documents spread across her desk contained evidence of a government conspiracy so morally reprehensible that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend its scope. For 40 years and one day, from 1932 to 1972, the United States Public Health Service had conducted what would become known as the most infamous medical experiment in human history. Hidden behind the respectable facade of scientific research, government doctors had systematically watched hundreds of African-American men die slow, agonizing deaths from untreated syphilis. The men believed they were receiving free healthcare for bad blood, a local term for various ailments that plagued the rural South. In reality, they were unwitting test subjects in a study designed to document every stage of syphilis progression until death. The researchers called it the Tuskegee Study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male. The men who suffered through it would simply call it betrayal. By the time Jean Heller's explosive investigation hit newsstands across America, the human cost was staggering beyond comprehension. Of the 399 men with syphilis who had entered the study in 1932, 128 had died directly from the disease or its complications. Another 100 had died from related causes that proper treatment could have prevented. 40 wives had been infected with syphilis through sexual contact with their unknowingly diseased husbands. 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis, condemned to lives of disability and suffering because their fathers had been denied treatment. All of this occurred while government physicians meticulously documented every symptom, every progression of the disease, every death, and did nothing to help. Even after penicillin was proven as a safe and effective cure for syphilis in the 1940s, researchers chose to continue their deadly observations rather than save lives they could have easily preserved. The conspiracy reached into the highest levels of American medical and governmental authority. The Centers for Disease Control, the American Medical Association, the Alabama State Health Department, and the prestigious Tuskegee Institute all played roles in enabling and protecting this 4-decade reign. The deception was so complete that many subjects died praising the excellent medical care they believed they had received from the very doctors who had condemned them to death. Before we dive deep into this horrifying true story of medical racism, government conspiracy, and institutional betrayal, make sure you're subscribed to Declassified. We uncover these buried horrors every week, investigating the classified documents and hidden histories that reveal the darkest corners of institutional power. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront the uncomfortable truths about how respected authorities have systematically exploited the most vulnerable members of society. This is the story of how America's most trusted medical institutions transformed poor black men into human laboratory rats, how they justified watching them die for science, and how they almost succeeded in keeping their crimes hidden forever. This is the story of the Tuskegee betrayal and why its shadow still haunts American medicine today. The year 1932 found America in the grip of economic catastrophe unlike anything the nation had ever experienced. The Great Depression had devastated communities across the country, but nowhere was the suffering more acute than in the rural South, where poverty had been endemic even before the stock market crash of 1929. Macon County, Alabama, embodied the worst aspects of this economic and social crisis. Located in the heart of Alabama's Black Belt, a region named for its rich soil but characterized by grinding poverty, Macon County was home to approximately 27,000 residents, 82% of whom were African American. Most worked as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, trapped in a system of economic bondage that had replaced slavery but maintained many of its oppressive characteristics. The average annual income for black families in Macon County in 1932 was less than $200, equivalent to roughly $4,000 in today's money. Most families lived in unpainted wooden shacks without electricity, running water, or indoor plumbing. Malnutrition was commonplace, and preventable diseases like pellagra, hookworm, and tuberculosis claimed lives regularly in communities that had no access to basic medical care. Into this environment of desperation stepped the United States Public Health Service, a federal agency established in 1798 and tasked with protecting the health of American citizens. Under the leadership of Surgeon General Hugh Smith Cumming, a career naval officer who had assumed his position in 1920, the PHS had begun conducting comprehensive studies of disease patterns in underserved populations. Dr. Cumming's interest in syphilis research stemmed from alarming statistics that had emerged from World War I military examinations. Army doctors had discovered that syphilis infection rates among African American recruits from the rural South were dramatically higher than those found in other populations. In some counties, infection rates exceeded 35% of the adult male population, a public health crisis of staggering proportions. The racial theories that dominated American medical thinking in the 1930s provided a convenient explanation for these disparate infection rates. Many white physicians believed that African Americans were naturally more susceptible to venereal diseases due to what they considered inherent moral and physical weaknesses. These racist assumptions would prove crucial in justifying the eventual decision to withhold treatment from infected men. At the center of this story stands Dr. Talia Farrow Clark, a distinguished career public health officer whose name would become forever linked with one of medicine's greatest ethical failures. Clark had earned his medical degree from the University of Virginia in 1902 and had spent 3 decades working in public health, building a reputation as a meticulous researcher and dedicated civil servant. Clark's path to infamy began with his assignment to study syphilis control programs in 6 southern states between 1928 and 1931. His mission was to evaluate the effectiveness of various treatment approaches and make recommendations for expanded public health interventions. What he discovered in rural Alabama would fundamentally alter the course of his career and the lives of hundreds of innocent men. The initial data from Macon County painted a disturbing picture of medical neglect and social vulnerability. Clark's preliminary surveys found that syphilis infection rates among African American men in the county approached 40%, one of the highest rates ever documented in the United States. Most infected men had never received any treatment for their condition, and many were unaware they were carrying a potentially fatal disease. Clark's early reports to his superiors in Washington described Macon County as an ideal laboratory for studying the natural progression of untreated syphilis. The isolation of the rural community, the stability of the population, and the absence of existing medical infrastructure created what he saw as perfect conditions for long-term observational research. The scientific precedent for such research came from Norway, where researchers had published studies on untreated syphilis in white populations between 1891 and 1910. The Norwegian data, collected from hospital records in Oslo, suggested that untreated syphilis might not be as uniformly fatal as American physicians believed. However, the Norwegian subjects had been primarily urban, white, and had received at least some medical attention during their illnesses. Dr. Clark proposed what he considered a revolutionary research question: how would untreated syphilis progress in rural African Americans compared to the urban Norwegian whites? This comparison, he argued, would provide crucial scientific data about racial differences in disease susceptibility and progression, information that could inform public health policy throughout the South. The Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute, founded by Booker T. Washington in 1881, seemed an ideal partner for such ambitious research. The historically black university had established a national reputation for practical education and community service, and its John A. Andrew Memorial Hospital served the medical needs of Macon County's African American population. Dr. Eugene Dibble, Jr., the African-American physician who headed the hospital, represented everything that Booker T. Washington had envisioned for black professional advancement. Born in South Carolina and educated at Atlanta University and Harvard Medical School, Dibble had returned to the South H2. Serve his community despite opportunities for more lucrative practice in the North. Dibble's decision to collaborate with the federal research program reflected both genuine desire to improve healthcare for African Americans and pragmatic recognition that such cooperation could bring resources and prestige to his institution. The promise of federal funding, modern medical equipment, and association with prestigious government researchers proved irresistible to a small hospital struggling to serve an impoverished population. The initial planning documents for what would become the Tuskegee Study revealed the casual racism and paternalistic attitudes that characterized white medical thinking of the era. Correspondence between Clark and his superiors consistently refers to potential subjects as specimens and discusses the research population as if they were laboratory animals rather than human beings deserving of medical care and respect. Dr. Clark's proposal, submitted to PHS headquarters in Washington during the spring of 1932, outlined a modest study that would last 6 to 8 months. The plan called for identifying men with syphilis through blood testing, providing some basic treatment, and documenting the disease's progression in those who could not be completely cured with available therapies. However, the economic realities of the Depression quickly transformed this limited treatment program into something far more sinister. As federal budgets tightened and resources for public health programs dwindled, the treatment component of the study became increasingly subordinated to its research objectives. By the time the study began in earnest during the fall of 1932, treatment had been virtually eliminated in favor of pure observation. The timing of the study's inception proved crucial to its eventual scope and duration. In 1932, there was no proven cure for syphilis. The standard treatments, toxic compounds containing mercury, arsenic, and bismuth, were expensive, dangerous, and only marginally effective. Most physicians considered syphilis a chronic condition that would eventually prove fatal regardless of intervention. This medical reality provided researchers with what they saw as ethical justification for their observational approach. If effective treatment was not available, they reasoned, there was no harm in studying the disease's natural progression while providing supportive care for symptoms. This logic would later be used to justify continuing the study long after effective treatments became widely available. The selection of Macon County as the study site also reflected calculated decisions about population, vulnerability, and researcher access. The county's geographic isolation meant that subjects would be unlikely to seek medical care elsewhere. The extreme poverty of the population ensured that free medical attention would be eagerly accepted. The low literacy rates meant that subjects would be unable to research their condition independently or challenge their doctor's explanations. Most importantly, the racial dynamics of the rural South in 1932 created a power structure that heavily favored white authority figures. African Americans had been conditioned by centuries of slavery and decades of Jim Crow segregation to defer to white professionals and accept whatever services were offered to them. This social conditioning would prove essential to maintaining the deception that characterized the study throughout its 4-decade duration. The institutional framework that would enable and protect the Tuskegee Study was already in place by 1932. The federal government's authority in public health matters was largely unquestioned. The medical profession was held in high regard and rarely subjected to outside scrutiny. Academic institutions enjoyed substantial autonomy in their research activities, and the African American subjects selected for the study possessed virtually no power to challenge or investigate the treatment they received. As Dr. Clark finalized his preparations for the study's launch during the summer of 1932, he could hardly have imagined that his 6-month research project would continue for 40 years, ultimately becoming a symbol of medical racism and institutional betrayal that would fundamentally alter American medical ethics. The stage was set for one of the most prolonged and systematic human rights violations in American medical history. On the morning of September 15, 1932, a convoy of government vehicles wound its way through the dusty back roads of Macon County, Alabama, carrying the architects of what would become America's longest-running medical atrocity. The cars bore official public health service insignia, lending an aura of federal authority to what residents would be told was a benevolent mission to improve health care for the county's African-American population. Leading this mission was Dr. Raymond Vonderlehr, a young and ambitious physician who had recently joined the PHS Venereal Disease Division. Vonderlehr had assumed control of the project from Dr. Taliaferro Clark, who had been reassigned to other duties, and he brought to the work a combination of scientific enthusiasm and moral blindness that would prove devastating for the men who would become his unwitting subjects. Dr. Vonderlehr's background reflected the racial attitudes typical of white Southern medical professionals of his era. Born in Virginia and educated at the University of Virginia Medical School, he had absorbed the prevailing beliefs about African American intellectual inferiority and moral weakness that pervaded medical education in the early 20th century. These beliefs would shape every aspect of his approach to the study and his relationship with its subjects. The recruitment strategy developed by Vonderlehr and his team represented a masterpiece of systematic deception, carefully designed to exploit the vulnerabilities and desperation of Macon County's African American population. The campaign began months before the first medical examinations, with public health nurses conducting community outreach that would lay the groundwork for 4 decades of lies. Eunice Rivers, a 28-year-old African-American nurse who had graduated from the Tuskegee Institute's nursing program in 1922, became the most crucial figure in this recruitment effort. Rivers possessed credentials that made her invaluable to the study's success. She was a trained medical professional, a respected member of the local community, and someone who could communicate effectively with potential subjects in their own dialect and cultural context. Rivers' role in the study's recruitment phase cannot be overstated. As correspondence from the period makes clear, white government researchers recognized that their own presence in rural African American communities would generate suspicion and resistance. They needed a trusted intermediary who could overcome the natural wariness that many black Southerners felt toward white authority figures, particularly those representing the federal government. The recruitment campaign began with carefully orchestrated visits to African American churches throughout Macon County. Rivers and other nurses would arrive on Sunday mornings when entire families gathered for worship and address congregations about a new government program designed to improve health conditions in the county. These presentations were masterfully crafted to appeal to the religious sensibilities and community pride of their audiences. Church leaders were told that the federal government had selected Macon County for special attention because of its reputation as a center of African American achievement and progress. The presence of the Tuskegee Institute, they were informed, had brought national recognition to the area and made it an ideal location for a demonstration project in rural health improvement. This approach exploited the genuine pride that many residents felt in their community's educational and cultural achievements. The Tuskegee Institute had indeed brought national attention to the area, and local residents were eager to participate in programs that seemed to build on that reputation. The nurses distributed flyers printed on official government letterhead announcing free medical examinations for bad blood, a local term that encompassed a wide range of health problems, including syphilis, anemia, fatigue, and general ill health. The flyers promised comprehensive physical examinations, free medicines, and treatment for any conditions discovered during the screening process. Critically, the recruitment materials made no mention of syphilis by name, instead relying on the ambiguous bad blood terminology that would allow researchers to maintain their deception throughout the study's duration. This linguistic sleight of hand was essential to the recruitment process, as many potential subjects might have been reluctant to participate in a study explicitly focused on venereal disease. The promise of free medical care proved irresistible to men who had never received professional medical attention in their lives. In 1932, medical care was a luxury that few African Americans in rural Alabama could afford. The average cost of a doctor's visit, approximately $2 to $3, represented several days' wages for most sharecroppers and day laborers. Beyond the immediate appeal of free healthcare, the recruitment campaign offered additional incentives that were carefully calculated to overcome any remaining resistance. Subjects would receive free hot meals on examination days, a significant benefit for men whose families often struggled to find adequate nutrition. They would also receive burial insurance policies worth $50, a sum that could ensure a dignified funeral in communities where many families could not afford proper burial for their deceased. The recruitment process also exploited the social dynamics of rural African American communities where word-of-mouth recommendations carried enormous weight. Early participants were encouraged to tell friends and neighbors about the excellent care they were receiving, creating a snowball effect that generated more volunteers than the study could accommodate. According to records preserved in the National Archives, the initial screening process examined approximately 1,400 men over the course of several months in late 1932 and early 1933. From this population, researchers selected 600 subjects based on criteria that were designed to create what they considered an ideal research cohort. The selection process was brutally calculating in its exploitation of human vulnerability. Researchers specifically sought men who were poor, uneducated, and unlikely to seek medical care elsewhere. They wanted subjects who would be easy to track over time, compliant with medical instructions, and unlikely to question the treatment they received. The final study population consisted of 399 men who tested positive for syphilis and 201 uninfected men who would serve as controls. All subjects were African American, male, over age 25, and residents of rural Macon County. Most were sharecroppers or agricultural laborers who earned less than $200 per year. The vast majority were illiterate and had never received professional medical care before joining the study. The informed consent process, such as it existed, relied on a carefully orchestrated combination of truth, half-truth, and outright deception. Subjects were told they had bad blood and needed medical attention, which was technically accurate. They were told the government was providing free healthcare to help improve conditions in their community, which contained elements of truth. They were told the study would last 6 to 8 months, which researchers knew to be false even as they made the promise. What subjects were not told proved far more significant than what they were told. They were not informed that they had syphilis, a sexually transmitted disease that carried significant social stigma. They were not told that the study was designed to continue until their deaths. They were not told that they would be denied effective treatment even when such treatment became available. They were not told that their participation would put their wives and children at risk of infection. Dr. Vonderlehr's correspondence with his superiors reveals the calculated nature of this deception and his contempt for the men whose lives he was manipulating. In a letter dated October 29, 1932, he wrote to Dr. Clark, "The men's attitude was very good and I believe they will cooperate well. The majority of the group are quite ignorant, and it should not be difficult to maintain their interest and cooperation for the length of time necessary to complete the study." The examination process itself was designed to reinforce the illusion that subjects were receiving beneficial medical care. Each man underwent a comprehensive physical examination that was more thorough than anything most had ever experienced. Blood was drawn for testing, hearts and lungs were examined with stethoscopes, and detailed medical histories were recorded. The most significant component of the examination process was the lumbar puncture, or spinal tap, performed to detect neurosyphilis. This procedure involved inserting a needle into the spinal canal to extract cerebrospinal fluid, which could then be tested for evidence that syphilis had spread to the nervous system. Spinal taps were painful, dangerous procedures that carried real risks of infection, paralysis, and death. In 1932, they were typically performed only when the information they provided would directly influence treatment decisions. For the men of Tuskegee, however, the spinal taps served no therapeutic purpose whatsoever. They were performed purely to gather research data about the progression of their disease. Researchers understood from the beginning that the spinal taps had no medical benefit for their subjects. Internal correspondence makes clear that the procedures were conducted solely to track the neurological progression of untreated syphilis for research purposes. Yet subjects were told that the spinal taps were a form of special free treatment for their condition. This deception regarding the spinal taps illustrates the casual cruelty that characterized the study from its inception. Researchers were willing to subject vulnerable men to painful, risky procedures that served no purpose other than advancing their scientific agenda. The subjects' pain and fear were simply acceptable costs of gathering data. The success of the recruitment campaign exceeded all expectations, generating demand for inclusion that far surpassed the study's capacity. Word of the free medical program spread throughout Macon County's African-American community like wildfire, carried by subjects who genuinely believed they were receiving excellent medical care. Community leaders embraced the program and actively promoted participation. Ministers praised the government's concern for black health from their pulpits. Teachers at local schools encouraged parents to take advantage of the free medical services. Even the local African-American newspaper, the Tuskegee Messenger, ran positive stories about the research initiative. This community endorsement was essential to the study's long-term success. When respected local leaders vouched for the program's legitimacy, it became much more difficult for individual subjects to question the treatment they received or to seek outside medical opinions about their condition. The researchers' manipulation of community trust represented one of their most cynical and effective strategies. By positioning themselves as benefactors rather than exploiters, they ensured that the very institutions that might have protected vulnerable men instead delivered them into the hands of their tormentors. As the recruitment phase concluded in early 1933, Dr. Vonderlehr and his colleagues had assembled what they considered an ideal research population, 399 men with untreated syphilis who believed they were receiving excellent medical care for their condition. These men would return faithfully for annual examinations, submit to painful procedures they believed were treatments, and recommend the program to friends and family members. None of them realized that they had just become subjects in an experiment designed to document their slow deaths from a disease that would eventually become entirely curable. None of them understood that the caring medical professionals who examined them each year had no intention of healing their condition, regardless of what treatments might become available. The web of deception that would trap these 399 men for the next 4 decades had been expertly woven. All that remained was to maintain the lies, document the deaths, and ensure that no outside interference would disrupt the deadly progression of science. By 1936, the true nature of what was occurring in Macon County, Alabama, had crystallized into something unprecedented in the annals of medical research. What had been conceived as a short-term study with at least some therapeutic component had evolved into a systematic death watch, a 4-decade exercise in medical sadism that would claim lives with the methodical precision of an execution chamber. The transformation from treatment program to human experimentation happened gradually, justified by incremental policy decisions that prioritize scientific data collection over human welfare at every crucial juncture. Each year that the study continued, each decision to deny treatment, each choice to prioritize observation over intervention, represented another step down a path that led inexorably to mass medical murder. Dr. John R. Heller, who assumed leadership of the Public Health Service's Venereal Disease Division in 1943, articulated the study's evolved purpose with chilling clarity in internal correspondence that would later be examined by congressional investigators. According to declassified documents, Heller wrote to subordinates, "The study will be of value in determining what effect untreated syphilis has on the human economy among people now living under conditions of modern civilization." The clinical language of Heller's memorandum revealed the complete dehumanization that had overtaken the research project. The men of Tuskegee were no longer patients deserving of care, or even human subjects worthy of ethical consideration. They had become components in an economic analysis, variables in an equation designed to calculate the societal cost of untreated disease. This dehumanization was not accidental but represented a necessary psychological adaptation that allowed researchers to continue their deadly work. By viewing subjects as specimens, rather than individuals, doctors and nurses could document suffering and death without experiencing the moral revulsion that would have ended the study immediately. The men of Tuskegee, however, remained completely unaware of their role as condemned prisoners in this medical death row. Annual examinations continued under the carefully maintained illusion of beneficial health care for bad blood. The same lies that had drawn them into the study in 1932 were, repeated with each subsequent visit, reinforced by the authority of medical professionals they trusted and the apparent concern of government officials who seemed committed to their welfare. Nurse Eunice Rivers played a crucial role in maintaining this elaborate deception throughout the study's middle decades. Her position as the primary point of contact between subjects and researchers made her essential to preserving the illusion of medical care. Rivers maintained detailed records of subjects' health status, family circumstances, and personal histories that enabled researchers to track their victims with remarkable precision. Rivers' role extended far beyond clinical data collection to encompass what can only be described as psychological manipulation, designed to maintain subjects' compliance and prevent them from seeking treatment elsewhere. She developed personal relationships with subjects and their families, providing social support and financial assistance that reinforced their dependence on the program and their loyalty to its supposed mission. Government records reveal the elaborate and cynical measures taken to prevent subjects from receiving actual medical treatment for their syphilis. When other public health programs began offering free syphilis treatment throughout Alabama during the 1930s and 1940s, study officials intervened directly to ensure their human subjects were excluded from these life-saving interventions. Correspondence between public health service officials and local physicians documents explicit instructions to deny treatment to study participants. Letters preserved in National Archives files show that researchers provided local doctors with lists of study subjects' names and instructed them to refuse syphilis treatment to these men if they sought care independently. Dr. Vonderlehr's correspondence with the Alabama State Health Department reveals the extent of institutional cooperation in maintaining the study's deadly deception. State health officials agreed to exclude study subjects from syphilis control programs and to maintain separate medical records that would prevent other healthcare providers from learning about subjects' true medical status. This conspiracy extended to the federal level, involving multiple government agencies in the systematic denial of medical care to American citizens. The Veterans Administration was instructed to deny syphilis treatment to study subjects who were military veterans. The Selective Service System was asked to exclude subjects from military draft requirements that would have provided access to military medical care. The most egregious example of institutional cooperation in denying treatment occurred in 1940 when the military began drafting young men for potential World War II service. Among those called for pre-induction physical examinations were 256 men from the Tuskegee study. Military physicians, following standard protocols, diagnosed active syphilis in these men and declared them eligible for immediate treatment through the armed services medical system. Study researchers intervened directly with draft boards, requesting that their subjects be excluded from both military service and medical treatment. This intervention condemned 256 men to continued infection and disease progression solely to preserve what researchers called the scientific integrity of their human experiment. Dr. Vonderlehr's correspondence with local draft board officials demonstrates the calculated cruelty behind this decision. In a letter dated January 21, 1941, he wrote, "It is desired to keep the men in the study and continue the observations. It would be unfortunate if this group, so carefully selected and followed through the years, should be broken up and scattered to the four winds. The language of this correspondence reveals the complete absence of moral consideration for the men whose lives were being manipulated. They were described as valuable research assets whose continued infection was essential to the study's scientific mission. Their potential military service was seen as an inconvenience that might disrupt data collection. Their access to life-saving medical treatment was viewed as a threat to research objectives. The advent of penicillin as a safe and effective cure for syphilis in the mid-1940s presented researchers with their most significant ethical challenge. By 1947, clinical trials had definitively proven that penicillin could cure syphilis at any stage of infection with minimal side effects and relatively low cost. The antibiotic was widely available through both private physicians and public health programs throughout the United States. For the men of Tuskegee, penicillin represented salvation from a disease that would otherwise progress through increasingly devastating stages, cardiovascular damage that would compromise their hearts and blood vessels, neurological deterioration that would affect their mental function and coordination, and, ultimately, death from complications that could have been easily prevented. Study officials chose data over lives. Internal memoranda reveal that researchers considered ending the study once effective treatment became available, but ultimately decided that the scientific value of continued observation outweighed moral obligations to cure their subjects. This decision represented perhaps the most explicitly murderous choice in the entire history of American medical research. Dr. John Cutler, who worked on the study during the late 1940s, later testified before congressional investigators about the rationale behind the decision to continue withholding treatment. According to his testimony, officials believed that many subjects were too damaged by advanced syphilis to benefit significantly from penicillin therapy, and that the scientific community needed definitive data about the natural progression of untreated disease. This justification was medically invalid and morally bankrupt. Penicillin was effective against syphilis at all stages of infection, and even men with advanced disease could benefit from treatment that would prevent further progression and reduce their risk of death. The notion that some subjects were too damaged to treat represented a decision to abandon human beings who could still have been helped. The decision to continue the study after effective treatment became available transformed what had begun as an observational study of a supposedly incurable disease into deliberate murder. Every death that occurred after 1947 was preventable, every case of tertiary syphilis that developed was avoidable, and every wife who became infected was the victim of a conscious choice to prioritize research over human life. Medical records from the 1950s and 1960s document the horrific progression of tertiary syphilis in study. Subjects who could have been cured with simple antibiotic treatment, cardiovascular syphilis C, caused heart failure, aneurysms, and sudden death. Neurosyphilis produced dementia, paralysis, blindness, and psychosis. Each symptom was carefully recorded, photographed, and analyzed by researchers who possessed the power to end their subjects' suffering but chose not to exercise it. The researchers' deception extended beyond the subjects themselves to encompass their families and the broader community. When wives of study participants developed syphilis, a predictable and preventable consequence of leaving their husbands untreated, they were not warned about the source of their infection or provided with information that might have protected them from further exposure. Children born to study participants faced the tragic consequence of congenital syphilis, a condition that could cause severe developmental disabilities, organ damage, and death. Researchers documented these cases as valuable data points while providing minimal intervention to help affected children or prevent future occurrences. The psychological toll of maintaining such an elaborate deception affected even some of the study's administrators. Nurse Rivers later testified that she sometimes struggled with the moral implications of her role, particularly when she witnessed the suffering of men and families she had come to know personally over decades of involvement. However, correspondence from the period reveals that Rivers consistently reinforced the researchers' lies, telling subjects and their families that the men were receiving excellent medical care for their condition. Her personal relationships with subjects made her complicity even more devastating, as men who trusted her completely were betrayed by someone they considered a friend and advocate. The study's continuation through the 1950s and 1960s required constant vigilance to prevent subjects from discovering the truth about their condition or seeking treatment elsewhere. Researchers developed sophisticated tracking systems to monitor subjects' movements and medical care, intervening whenever necessary to maintain their deadly control over the men's health decisions. By 1969, when the study entered its final phase, 130 subjects had died, with at least 28 deaths directly attributable to syphilis and over 100 deaths related to complications that could have been prevented with proper treatment. The human cost of this 4-decade experiment in medical sadism was documented in the researchers' own statistics, yet the study continued with the full support of federal health agencies and medical institutions. The transformation of the Tuskegee study from a modest research project into systematic medical murder illustrates how institutional cultures can gradually normalize atrocity through incremental moral compromises. Each decision to prioritize research over treatment, each choice to maintain deception rather than provide honest medical care, represented another step toward complete moral bankruptcy. The men who died during these middle decades of the study perished believing they had received excellent medical care from government doctors who cared about their welfare. They never knew that. Their deaths were deliberate outcomes in a research protocol that valued scientific data more than human life. They died praising the very system that had condemned them to preventable suffering and death. Charlie Pollard was 23 years old when he joined the Tuskegee study in 1932. A sharecropper with a third-grade education, Pollard worked long days in Alabama cotton fields for wages that barely fed his family. When government nurses told him he could receive free medical care for his bad blood, it seemed like an answer to his prayers. For 40 years, Pollard faithfully attended his annual medical examinations. He submitted to blood draws, physical examinations, and painful spinal taps that researchers told him were treatments for his condition. He recommended the program to friends and neighbors, proud to be part of what he believed was a government effort to improve black health in the rural South. Medical records preserved in the National Archives document Pollard's slow deterioration from latent syphilis to the final stages of tertiary disease. By 1960, cardiovascular syphilis had damaged his heart. By 1965, neurosyphilis had begun affecting his cognitive function. Throughout this progression, researchers meticulously recorded each symptom while providing no treatment that might have prevented his suffering. Pollard died in 1968, never knowing that a simple course of penicillin could have saved his life. His death certificate listed cardiovascular syphilis as the primary cause of death, a diagnosis that researchers had observed developing for over 30 years. Herman Shaw entered the study as a robust 32-year-old farmer. Shaw could read and write, skills that made him valuable to researchers who needed subjects capable of following complex instructions for specimen collection and appointment schedules. Shaw's intelligence also made him more susceptible to the sophisticated deception that characterized the study. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Shaw experienced the progressive symptoms of tertiary syphilis. Cardiovascular complications cause chest pain and shortness of breath that limited his ability to work. Neurological effects produced headaches, confusion, and personality changes that strained his relationships with family members. Each symptom was carefully documented by study physicians, who photographed Shaw's lesions and recorded detailed observations of his mental state. Shaw's wife, Fanny, contracted syphilis from her husband during the 1950s. When she sought treatment from local physicians, study researchers intervened to ensure that her care would not interfere with the integrity of their research. Fanny Shaw died of syphilis-related complications in 1963, having never been told that her husband's participation in a government study had led to her infection. The children born to study participants faced particularly tragic consequences. Congenital syphilis, entirely preventable with proper treatment of infected fathers, occurred in families throughout Macon County. Research records document dozens of cases where study subjects fathered children with birth defects, developmental disabilities, and other complications related to prenatal syphilis exposure. Willie Johnson's case illustrates the intergenerational impact of the study's deception. Johnson, enrolled in 1933, fathered 4 children during his participation in the research. 2 were born with congenital syphilis, resulting in severe developmental disabilities that would affect them throughout their lives. Study researchers documented these births as valuable data while providing minimal intervention to help the affected children. The economic impact on subjects' families compounded their medical suffering. Men whose health deteriorated due to untreated syphilis often lost their ability to work, plunging already impoverished families deeper into destitution. Wives who contracted syphilis from their husbands faced their own health crises while caring for sick spouses and disabled children. Government records reveal that researchers were well aware of these secondary effects. Internal correspondence discusses the study's impact on families and communities, but frames these consequences as acceptable costs of scientific progress. Dr. Sidney Olansky, who directed the study during the 1950s and 1960s, wrote that the research provided an unusual opportunity to study the untreated syphilis in the Negro male. By 1969, 130 study subjects had died, with 28 deaths directly attributable to syphilis and an additional 100 deaths related to complications from the disease. 40 wives had been infected with syphilis, and 19 children had been born with congenital syphilis. These statistics, compiled by researchers themselves, documented the devastating human cost of their 4-decade experiment. The psychological trauma inflicted on study participants and their families extended far beyond the physical effects of untreated disease. Men who had trusted government physicians with their lives discovered they had been systematically deceived and exploited. Families who had believed they were receiving superior medical care learned they had been denied life-saving treatment for the sake of scientific observation. Survivors later described the sense of betrayal that followed the study's exposure. Men who had recommended the program to friends and relatives carried guilt for having unknowingly facilitated others' exploitation. Children who had grown up believing their fathers were receiving excellent medical care struggled to understand how respected institutions could have orchestrated such an elaborate deception. The Tuskegee Study's continuation for 4 decades required the active participation and silent complicity of numerous individuals and institutions. Government documents reveal a systematic pattern of cover-up, misdirection, and institutional protection that enabled researchers to continue their deadly experiment despite growing ethical concerns within the medical community. The Centers for Disease Control, established in 1946, assumed oversight of the Tuskegee study from the Public Health Service. CDC officials not only continued the research but expanded its scope, adding new control groups and extending follow-up procedures. Internal CDC memos from the 1960s discuss plans to continue the study until the death of the last participant, treating the men's lives as endpoints in a research protocol rather than human beings deserving of medical care. Dr. William J. Brown, director of the CDC's venereal disease program, became one of the study's most ardent defenders during the 1960s. Brown's correspondence with subordinates reveals his view that the research had progressed too far to be abandoned for ethical concerns. In a 1969 memo, Brown wrote, "Nothing learned will prevent, find, or cure a single case of infectious syphilis or bring us closer to our basic mission of controlling venereal disease in the United States." Despite this acknowledgement that the study served no public health purpose, Brown continued to advocate for its completion. His rationale centered on the irreplaceable nature of the data being collected and the scientific community's need for definitive information about untreated syphilis progression in African Americans. The medical establishment's response to growing ethical concerns about the study reveals the extent to which professional self-interest superseded patient welfare. Throughout the 1960s, researchers published dozens of papers based on Tuskegee data in prestigious medical journals. The American Heart Association, the American Medical Association, and other professional organizations honored study researchers with awards and speaking engagements. None of these professional recognitions acknowledged the ethical problems inherent in the research. Peer reviewers at medical journals failed to question how researchers had obtained 40 years of data on untreated syphilis when effective treatments had been available since the 1940s. Professional organizations failed to investigate the methodology behind research that clearly involved withholding standard medical care from patients. The study's academic supporters developed elaborate justifications for its continuation. Dr. J.K. Schaefer, who worked on syphilis research at the CDC, argued that ending the study would waste the investment already made in decades of data collection. This economic argument, that past exploitation justified continued exploitation, became a standard defense among study advocates. Academic medicine's complicity extended beyond passive acceptance to active participation. Medical schools used Tuskegee data in epidemiology courses, teaching students to analyze disease progression, statistics without questioning how such data had been obtained. Textbooks incorporated study findings into standard discussions of syphilis pathology, normalizing research that violated every principle of medical ethics. The Tuskegee Institute's role in enabling the study deserves particular scrutiny. As a historically black university dedicated to advancing African American education and welfare, Tuskegee might have been expected to protect its community from exploitation. Instead, university officials provided facilities, credibility, and cover for 4 decades of medical abuse. Dr. Eugene Dibble, who had initially agreed to collaborate with the study, remained involved until his retirement in 1946. Throughout his tenure, Dibble defended the research as beneficial to African American health, even as evidence mounted that participants were being denied life-saving treatment. His successor, Dr. John Chennault, continued this policy of institutional support through the 1960s. The relationship between federal researchers and Tuskegee officials was symbiotic and corrupt. Government agencies provided funding, prestige, and professional opportunities to university personnel. In return, Tuskegee provided legitimacy, community access, and protection from criticism that might have ended the study decades earlier. Nurse Eunice Rivers occupied a unique position in this network of institutional complicity. As an African-American healthcare professional, Rivers possessed the trust of study participants and their families. Her presence at medical examinations and her role as the primary contact between researchers and subjects lent credibility to the deception that participants were receiving beneficial medical care. Rivers later claimed that she believed she was helping her community by facilitating the study. However, correspondence from the 1950s and 1960s reveals that she was fully aware of the research's true nature. In letters to supervisors, Rivers discussed strategies for preventing subjects from seeking syphilis, treatment elsewhere, and methods for maintaining their participation despite growing suspicion about the program's purposes. The Alabama State Health Department's cooperation with the study enabled researchers to maintain their deception on a statewide level. When other syphilis control programs threatened to provide treatment to study participants, state health officials intervened to protect the research. This cooperation extended to falsifying public health records and misleading federal auditors about the true nature of the Tuskegee program. Local physicians in Macon County either actively supported the study or remained silent about its ethical violations. Many received professional benefits from their association with government researchers, including consultation fees, publication opportunities, and access to federal research grants. This financial incentive structure ensured that potential whistleblowers had strong motivations to maintain their silence. The study's institutional protection network included elements that actively worked to suppress criticism and investigation. When medical professionals began questioning the research during the 1960s, study officials mobilized professional organizations, academic institutions, and government agencies to discredit critics and defend the program's scientific value. Peter Buxton was an unlikely candidate to expose America's most notorious medical experiment. A 27-year-old venereal disease investigator working for the Public Health Service in San Francisco, Buxton had stumbled across references to the Tuskegee study while reviewing epidemiological literature in 1965. What he read troubled him profoundly. According to testimony he would later give to congressional investigators, Buxton was initially confused by the research protocols he encountered in internal PHS documents. The studies described untreated syphilis in populations where effective treatment had been available for over 20 years. When he inquired about these apparent oversights, supervisors explained that the research involved deliberately withholding treatment to observe disease progression. Buxton's moral outrage at this revelation led him to file the first formal complaint about the study's ethics in 1966. His memo to superiors questioned both the scientific value and ethical justification for continuing research that condemned men to preventable death and disability. The response from PHS leadership was swift and unambiguous. The study would continue as planned. Dr. William J. Brown, who received Buxton's complaint, dismissed the ethical concerns as irrelevant to the study's scientific mission. Brown's written response, preserved in congressional investigation files, argued that the research subjects were too damaged by advanced syphilis to benefit from treatment, and that ending the study would waste decades of accumulated data. Frustrated by his supervisor's refusal to address his concerns, Buxton continued to press for the study's termination through official channels. His persistence made him increasingly unpopular within the PHS hierarchy, and he faced professional retaliation, including poor performance evaluations and threats to his job security. In 1968, Buxton received support from an unexpected source. The CDC's own ad hoc advisory panel convened to review the study's continued relevance. The panel, composed of medical professionals and ethicists, was initially expected to endorse the research's continuation. However, panel discussions revealed significant concern about the study's methodology and ethics. Meeting transcripts, released during later congressional investigations, document intense debate among panel members about the study's justification. Dr. Ira Myers, representing the American Medical Association, questioned whether the research could produce any information that would justify its human cost. Dr. J. Healy, from the National Institutes of Health, argued that the study violated fundamental principles of medical practice. Despite these concerns, the advisory panel ultimately recommended continuing the study with minor modifications. The panel's final report, issued in 1969, acknowledged ethical problems with the research, but concluded that its scientific value outweighed moral objections. This decision would prove to be one of the last institutional endorsements the study would receive. Buxton's campaign to expose the study gained momentum when he left the Public Health Service in 1970. Free from the constraints of government employment, he began approaching journalists with documentation of the research. Most news organizations initially showed little interest in a story that seemed both technically complex and historically remote. The breakthrough came when Buxton contacted Jean Heller, an Associated Press reporter with experience covering medical issues. Heller recognized the significance of Buxton's documentation and began her own investigation into the study's scope and impact. Her research revealed that the Tuskegee experiment was not a historical curiosity, but an ongoing atrocity that continued to claim lives. Heller's investigation uncovered the full extent of the study's deception and the institutional network that had protected it for 40 years. She interviewed survivors, examined medical records, and documented the trail of death and disability that the research had produced. Her findings painted a picture of systematic medical abuse that violated every standard of ethical research. The Associated Press published Heller's exposé on July 25, 1972, under the headline, "Syphilis Victims in U.S. Study Went Untreated for 40 Years." The story detailed the study's methodology, its human cost, and the ongoing deception of participants who still believed they were receiving beneficial medical care. Public reaction to the revelation was immediate and intense. Civil rights organizations denounced the study as medical genocide. Congressional leaders called for investigations and hearings. Medical professionals expressed shock and outrage at their colleagues' conduct. The story dominated national news coverage for weeks, becoming one of the most significant medical scandals in American history. The government's initial response to the exposure revealed the depth of institutional investment in protecting the study. PHS officials defended the research as scientifically valuable and ethically justified by the standards of its time. CDC administrators argued that ending the study would waste the scientific investment of 4 decades. Dr. J.D. Miller, director of the CDC, held a press conference on July 26, 1972, attempting to minimize the scandal's significance. Miller claimed that study participants had received excellent medical care for conditions other than syphilis, and that researchers had acted according to accepted medical practices of their era. These defensive responses only intensified public outrage and drew additional media attention to the study's ethical violations. Investigative reporters began examining other government medical research programs, uncovering additional examples of unethical experimentation on vulnerable populations. Senator Edward Kennedy, chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Health, announced hearings on the Tuskegee study within days of the story's publication. Kennedy's statement condemned the research as an outrageous and intolerable situation that demanded immediate congressional action. The legal implications of the study's exposure became apparent as civil rights attorneys began organizing class action lawsuits on behalf of survivors and their families. These legal challenges would ultimately result in a $10 million settlement and the establishment of comprehensive medical care for affected individuals. On July 26, 1972, one day after the Associated Press story broke, the Department of Health, Education and Welfare officially terminated the Tuskegee study. The announcement came 40 years and 1 day too late for the men who had died believing they were receiving medical care while actually serving as unwilling subjects in a deadly experiment. The termination of the Tuskegee study on July 26, 1972, marked the beginning rather than the end of a national reckoning with medical ethics that continues to reverberate today. The immediate aftermath of the study's exposure revealed the inadequacy of existing oversight mechanisms and the urgent need for fundamental reforms in human subjects research. Senator Edward Kennedy's hearings, which began in February 1973, provided the first comprehensive public examination of the study's methodology, institutional support system, and human impact. Testimony from government officials, researchers, and survivors painted a devastating picture of systematic abuse enabled by professional indifference and institutional racism. Dr. J.D. Miller of the CDC faced particularly intense questioning about his agency's role in continuing the study despite growing ethical concerns. Under oath, Miller acknowledged that researchers had known effective treatment was available but chose to withhold it for scientific purposes. His admission that the study served no public health function demolished government claims that the research had been justified by its potential benefits. The congressional hearings revealed that Tuskegee was not an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of unethical medical experimentation on vulnerable populations. Testimony described radiation, experiments on prisoners, drug testing on military personnel, and surgical procedures performed on institutionalized patients without informed consent. Charlie Pollard, one of the few surviving study participants, provided the most powerful testimony of the hearings. Pollard, then 63 years old and suffering from advanced cardiovascular syphilis, described 4 decades of deception by medical professionals he had trusted with his life, his testimony delivered in a voice weakened by disease that could have been cured with a simple antibiotic, brought many observers to tears. "They never told me I had bad blood," Pollard testified. "They said I had bad blood and they were going to help me, but they never helped me." His simple words captured the profound betrayal that defined the study's relationship with its subjects. The legal response to the study's exposure culminated in a class action lawsuit filed by civil rights attorney Fred Gray on behalf of survivors and their families. Gray, who had previously represented Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr., argued that the study constituted a form of genocide directed against African Americans. The federal government's decision to settle the lawsuit out of court for $10 million in 1974 represented an acknowledgement of legal liability, but avoided a trial that might have revealed additional details about the study's operation and institutional support. The settlement provided lifetime medical care for survivors and their families, but no amount of money could restore the lives lost or repair the damage inflicted by 4 decades of medical abuse. The COVID-19 pandemic of 2020-2021 provided the most recent test of whether the medical establishment had learned from Tuskegee's lessons. Initial vaccine hesitancy in African American communities was frequently attributed to Tuskegee legacy effects, with public health officials struggling to overcome historical mistrust while promoting vaccination efforts. Dr. Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, explicitly addressed Tuskegee's ongoing impact during the pandemic response. In interviews and public statements, Fauci acknowledged that the study had created understandable suspicion of government, health initiatives in minority communities, and emphasized the need for transparency and community engagement in dossiers and public health efforts. The Tuskegee study, while uniquely horrific in its scope and duration, was not an isolated incident in American medical history. Congressional investigations following the study's exposure revealed a disturbing pattern of unethical experimentation on vulnerable populations that extended across decades and involved multiple government agencies. The Willowbrook hepatitis study, conducted from 1956 to 1970 at a New York State institution for intellectually disabled children, deliberately infected residents with hepatitis to study the disease's progression and test potential vaccines. Researchers justified this experimentation by arguing that the children would likely contract hepatitis anyway due to overcrowded conditions at the facility. Government documents reveal that the Willowbrook study was conducted with the knowledge and approval of state health officials and federal research agencies. Parents were told that their children were receiving beneficial medical care, not that they were being deliberately infected with a potentially fatal disease. The study continued for 14 years, affecting hundreds of children, many of whom suffered severe complications from their infections. The CIA's MK-Ultra program, exposed during congressional investigations of the 1970s, involved extensive medical experimentation on unwitting subjects between 1953 and 1973. University-based researchers, funded through government grants, administered LSD and other psychoactive drugs to psychiatric patients, prisoners, and other vulnerable individuals without their knowledge or consent. Dr. Ewan Cameron's experiments at Montreal's Allen Memorial Institute represented some of the most extreme MK-Ultra research. Cameron's psychic driving techniques involved subjecting patients to massive doses of LSD, prolonged sensory deprivation, and repetitive audio messages designed to break down their personalities. Many subjects suffered permanent psychological damage from these procedures. The radiation experiments conducted on prisoners, hospital patients, and military personnel between 1944 and 1974 demonstrated the extent to which government agencies were willing to sacrifice individual welfare for research purposes. These studies, involving over 4,000 subjects, exposed participants to dangerous levels of radiation to study its effects on human physiology. At the Fernald School in Massachusetts, researchers fed radioactive oatmeal to intellectually disabled children to study calcium absorption. Parents were told their children were joining a science club that would provide them with special nutrition. The children received no medical benefit from their participation and were exposed to radiation levels that exceeded safety standards by substantial margins. The common elements linking these various studies: targeting of vulnerable populations, systematic deception, institutional protection, and prioritization of research goals over participant welfare, suggest that the Tuskegee study was part of a broader culture of exploitation within American medical research. The gradual exposure of these various research abuses during the 1970s created a crisis of confidence in American medical institutions that paralleled broader social movements challenging authority and demanding accountability. The civil rights movement, anti-war protests, and feminist activism provided a context for understanding medical experimentation as another form of institutional oppression. The Tuskegee study's relevance to contemporary medical practice extends far beyond its historical significance as an example of research misconduct. The study's legacy continues to shape discussions about informed consent, research ethics, health disparities, and the relationship between medical institutions and minority communities. Modern bioethics emerged as a distinct field, partly in response to revelations about Tuskegee and other research abuses. The principle of informed consent, now considered fundamental to ethical medical practice, was developed specifically to prevent the kind of systematic deception that characterized the study. However, implementing meaningful informed consent remains challenging in many contemporary research contexts. Emergency medical research presents ongoing ethical dilemmas that echo Tuskegee's lessons. When patients are unconscious or otherwise unable to provide consent, researchers must balance the potential benefits of innovative treatments against the risk of exploiting vulnerable individuals. Current regulations allow for exception from informed consent under specific circumstances, but these provisions remain controversial. The use of stored biological samples for research purposes raises questions about ongoing consent that directly relate to Tuskegee's legacy. When blood samples or tissue specimens are collected for one purpose but later used for different research, questions arise about whether the original consent covers the new use. African American communities have been particularly vocal about these concerns, citing Tuskegee as an example of how medical institutions have exploited their biological material. International health research conducted by American institutions faces heightened scrutiny due to Tuskegee's global impact on perceptions of American medical ethics. Studies conducted in developing countries must navigate complex questions about appropriate standards of care, fair distribution of research benefits, and protection of vulnerable populations. The development of personalized medicine and genomic research has created new opportunities for exploitation that require constant vigilance to prevent Tuskegee-style abuses. The collection and analysis of genetic data from minority populations could potentially benefit these communities through targeted therapies, but historical experience creates legitimate suspicion about researchers' motivations and commitments. Health disparities research, ironically, faces particular challenges due to Tuskegee's legacy. Studies designed to understand and address health inequities often focus on minority populations, but recruitment for such research is complicated by community mistrust of medical institutions. Researchers must work to demonstrate genuine commitment to community benefit while acknowledging the historical basis for skepticism. The COVID-19 pandemic provided a real-time test of whether American medical institutions had learned from Tuskegee's lessons. Vaccine development proceeded at unprecedented speed, raising questions about safety and adequate testing that resonated particularly strongly in African American communities. Public health messaging during the pandemic frequently invoked Tuskegee when addressing vaccine hesitancy in minority communities. However, some critics argued that this approach reinforced rather than addressed underlying mistrust by repeatedly reminding communities of past medical abuse rather than demonstrating current trustworthiness. The globalization of medical research has created new opportunities for exploitation that require international cooperation to prevent. Studies that would be prohibited in the United States due to ethical concerns may be conducted in countries with less stringent oversight, raising questions about whether institutions are simply exporting rather than eliminating unethical practices. As we reach the end of this investigation into the Tuskegee study, the fundamental questions raised by this 4-decade betrayal remain as relevant today as they were when the story first broke in 1972. How could respected medical institutions systematically deceive and exploit vulnerable populations? What safeguards exist to prevent similar abuses? And most importantly, have we truly learned from this dark chapter in American medical history? The men of Tuskegee, Charlie Pollard, Herman Shaw, and the hundreds of others whose lives were sacrificed for scientific observation, deserve to be remembered not as victims, but as human beings, whose trust was betrayed by the very institutions sworn to protect and heal. Their suffering was not inevitable or accidental, but the direct result of decisions made by educated professionals who chose research data over human dignity. The institutional response to Tuskegee's exposure reveals both progress and persistent challenges in American medical ethics. The establishment of institutional review boards, informed consent requirements, and federal oversight mechanisms represents genuine improvement in protecting research participants. However, the ongoing effects of medical mistrust in minority communities demonstrate that regulatory changes alone cannot repair the damage inflicted by decades of abuse. The study's international impact reminds us that medical ethics cannot be confined by national boundaries. American medical research operates in a global context where historical abuses continue to influence perceptions of Western medicine and scientific authority. The responsibility for addressing Tuskegee's legacy extends beyond domestic policy to encompass America's role in international health initiatives. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated both the progress made since Tuskegee and the work that remains to be done. 1. The development of safe and effective vaccines in record time showed what medical science can accomplish when properly motivated and funded. However, the persistence of vaccine hesitancy in communities with historical reasons to mistrust medical authorities revealed that Tuskegee's legacy continues to influence contemporary public health efforts. Their story must continue to be told, not as historical curiosity, but as urgent reminder of the vigilance required to protect human dignity in an age of advancing medical capability. Only by remembering their suffering and learning from their betrayal can we hope to fulfill the promise that such abuse will never, again, be tolerated in the name of medical progress. The Tuskegee study ended in 1972, but its legacy continues to shape American medicine, public health, and research ethics. As long as medical institutions hold power over vulnerable populations, the lessons of Tuskegee remain relevant. As long as the temptation exists to prioritize scientific advancement over individual welfare, these men's sacrifice demands our continued attention. In the end, the question is not whether we have completely overcome the mentality that enabled the Tuskegee study, but whether we remain committed to the ongoing work of building more ethical, more just, and more trustworthy medical institutions. That work continues, guided by the voices of those who suffered and informed by the knowledge that the price of progress must never again be paid with deliberate human suffering. What do you think about the institutional safeguards we have today? Are they sufficient to prevent another Tuskegee? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you're subscribed to Declassified for more investigations into the hidden histories that continue to shape our world. These stories aren't just about the past, they're warnings about the vigilance required to protect human dignity in every generation.